Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Project Flux podcast. Today on the spotlight, we have Yoshi as normal. How are you, Yoshi?
I'm very good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all. Not bad at all. Really excited for today because joining us as our guest is Ritavan, also known as the Slassog guy. You'll find out what Slassog is shortly. He is the best-selling author of Data Impact, which we're going to talk about quite a lot today, and you'll have links to this book in your show notes. But he's also an entrepreneur, an investor, and a keynote speaker. So we're really lucky to have you on, Ritavan. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Yoshi. Great to chat with you guys.
Brilliant. Well, we've got a lot to cover. We are going to talk about your book, and we're also going to get your thoughts about AI and what AI means for you. But before we do that, we have got this tradition now on the podcast where we start by asking people what's the big thing on their mind at the moment, particularly in terms of data or AI. What's the thing kind of keeping you up at night that's occupying your brain cells?
Yeah, so for me, after the launch of Data Impact about 3 months ago, based on the feedback I got from business leaders who've read it, something that I'm really now obsessing increasingly about is the leverage part in the book broadly, in my 6-step framework. And the idea there is really everyone's chasing quick wins, right? But we know logically, right, whether it's in sports like running a marathon or playing any kind of game, right, that is about compounding and winning long term. A bunch of quick wins don't add up to a big win of the long game, right? And so what I'm trying to get at is you cannot string a whole bunch of quick wins and get a big win of the long game. And everyone's obsessed with quick wins, right? Like there's just a lot of people writing about it, posting about it, etc. So there is content for that. And what I realized once Data Impact went out is that there's a bit of a gap where I think there's not been enough thinking around how do you really compound and win big with data, right? Over medium to long periods, meaning, I'm not talking of like hitting the quarter or the next quarter, but like perhaps a year, 2 years, 3 years, right? All the way to 10 years, right? Because once you have a compounding logic, right, to the way you think about data and invest in data, then it does not matter whether it's a year, 3 years, or 5 years, or 10 years, right? Because the logic will drive the compounding. So it's away from this quick win, let's sprint 100 meters to how do we start winning marathons?
Interesting, because we do unfortunately live in this world now of like attention deficit, and everyone wants things straight away. And because of the rate of change of technology, where things are in some ways available straight away, we've got the advent of vibe coding and artificial intelligence. People are getting used to getting things straight away. But I think you're right that for things of value, sometimes you need to think more strategically. And I know you talk about that a lot in your book. So we'll come to that a lot later. And I think, if you're thinking about it a lot, I think it's something that a lot of people should be thinking about a bit more as well. Stop chasing the quick wins.
Well, I think with us, James, just in project delivery, the two reasons why I find that the profession looks for quick wins is one, because they're unfamiliar with uncharted territory, and getting quick wins allows them to offer proof of concepts, but also just understand the technology a bit more. And I think, from construction, I think it's also more around the fact that people don't like change. So they're the two biggest things. Now, Ritavan, from a product management perspective, do you see crossover? Why do you think people chase quick wins over the data impact, the bigger impact, like your book?
No, I think you're very right on this, Yoshi, right? So one, as you pointed out, is people want to sort of, test the waters. So you want to put in your toe before you dive in, right? You don't know what the temperature, etc. And so it's very much that. And I think like I've been operating now for a decade in this field. And a decade ago, I think it was okay to go about it like that because, it was truly new. I think a decade on, if we're still sort of just trying to dip our toes on the edge of the water, then you're never going to swim across the lake or the river, right? So at some point you have to dive in. And I think the reason why no one's diving in is that we're essentially walking every few meters along the river and dipping our toes, right? And what I'm trying to get at is, we had a big excitement around deep learning, and 2 years later it's 3 years later it's reinforcement learning, and then it's something else, and was transformers. Now it's LLMs. I'm willing to bet in a few years it'll be something else. And so what happens is we're constantly we feel the river is changing, but it's just a river, and all we're doing is walking along it and dipping our toes in the water, not swimming across it. And that's also to the previous question, is what I'm now really obsessed about is trying to figure out what does it mean to swim across the river, like not in abstract, like vision kind of sense, but really like how do you really sort of make money with this and understand the fundamental dynamics around this, right? So the first principle is sort of systems rethink approach to figuring out how do we go beyond this. And the second point is, which is if you're an operator, right, in any way, in any context, but especially in legacy sectors like construction and real estate, etc., you are under tremendous pressure to hit your quarter. You're under tremendous pressure to deliver some kind of tangible value quickly, and that's just how it works. Right? That's just the nature of operating, and it's also the nature of services, right? And so I think it's something that I've been speaking about recently is that I had to take a step back from operating for half a year to get mental clarity around some of this stuff, because if 1 year in the trenches, you don't have the altitude to even think and even the headspace to think about this.
But do you think that because you mentioned we're walking along, we're dipping our toes, we're not really swimming to the other side of the lake, and then you mentioned reinforcement learning, deep learning, these other techniques. Do you then think that progression is the enemy of adoption? Because if you have so many new things coming out, if you adopt one thing and you go deep down that vertical, what if it becomes redundant? What if like RPA, for like let's say RPA was one thing, everyone it was the thing that everyone was talking about a few years ago. Then AI came in and said, well, you can change the way we do things, you can automate differently. So then companies like UiPath, for instance, who were going down that route, they had to pivot and change because of how fast it was changing.
Yeah, in fact, I would sort of reframe it, which is just adoption is not going to make you win in a market, right? So what I argue in the book too, and I use this anecdote from Charlie Munger when Berkshire Hathaway was invested in textile mills, and one of their senior executives runs in and tells Warren Buffett there is a textile mill that's twice as efficient, and the expectation was everyone's going to get excited and we're going to get this latest technology, etc. But as Charlie Munger points out, someone like Buffett really understands the impact of what off-the-shelf technology has. And his reaction is, if that's the case, we'll check if that's the case. If that's the case, we're going to exit the business. And I think the key insight here that a lot of us, or anyone who is excited about technology and about moving forward and operating doesn't realize, or what's important to keep in mind is this is a market, right? Meaning if you can buy technology off the shelf, right, and let's assume that let's give the benefit of doubt to the technology vendor, right? Let's say it does increase output, right, productivity, whatever, right? So broadly it makes that better, that that what it promises to do. So if that's the case, you buy that technology off the shelf, the vendor is going to go to the next guy and sell it to them, right, in the market. And so now what's going to happen is that everyone in your market will buy that technology, right, and will start, in the best case, right, will start using it to whatever extent, right? And what that results in, right, is that demand for whatever you're offering in the market, whatever value you're delivering to your customer, has not changed dramatically, but supply now has increased. Yeah. And this is really economics 101, right? Mm-hmm. What that's going to do is press prices down. And so now there are two winners in any kind of technology adoption cycle. The first winner is the vendor, right? The technology vendor, the person selling the textile mills, the person trying to get you to use off-the-shelf technology XYZ, right? And what they've essentially done, if you as a business think about your profit margins, right, as a stack, so sort of the most reliable, the most guaranteed part, the more risky ones, the more on the fringe, the more trendy part, most of the digital paradigm companies, right? So basically the software tech companies of the past 2 decades, they've essentially sold subscriptions, which means they're taking the most predictable part of your profit margin and skimming it off. Mm-hmm. What you are left with, right, as a business is the less profitable, more volatile part of the business. Right? And then it's no surprise, right, that their profit margins, their gross margins are massive, that their valuations are higher, because they're essentially skimming off the best part of your business model.
So that's really interesting, because you gave us that great analogy there from Warren Buffett. But if we take that, and I know I'm jumping about a bit because we're going to talk about AI later, but effectively that technology, which is AI now, this generalized AI, it's getting better and better all the time, and that's going to be in the hands of everyone. So the person that's going to, or the entity that's going to get the most benefit from that, taking what you're saying, is the vendors, the OpenAIs, the Googles, the Groks and the X's. What does that mean for professional services then?
Right.
Are we really facing a significant impact on the people who deliver professional services, and what should they be thinking about?
Yeah. So I mean, two responses, and again, this is something that it's a developing story. So it's very, and I don't want to be the guy sort of making predictions of how the future will look. That's not rigorous and that's absurd. But I think two directions that are worth looking at is one that these LLM vendors are now going to try to build out professional services. So there've been some announcements in the press about how they want to do that. Whether it's just noise and hype or whatever, or whether it's going to materialize, we don't know. But I think more importantly, independently of what other people do, I think every person should now really focus on impact, right? Focus on really creating value beyond just one quarter, right?
Yeah.
Because if you do hit your quarter, it's nice, but in the big scheme of things, big deal, right? That's not how you're going to win big. And so one way to look at it is that make sure you hit your quarter, but also think beyond. So think of it like a portfolio. Of course you want to make sure you have bread on the table, you have food on the table today or like this quarter, but you also want to have a strategy so that you have bread and food on the table 3 years hence. And so I think sort of stretching the way you think your time horizon, stretching your time horizon is something I think that's super important for everyone, whether you are a services company, whether you are a traditional, legacy construction company or a real estate company. I think that is something worth focusing on.
Yeah, Ritavan, well, we'll move on to the Slassog bit in a moment, but because you mentioned Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, and I was looking at the Buffett indicator recently, and there were three spikes, one way early on, another when the dot-com boom was, and then another recently. I think it's as high as it's ever been. And I was looking at kind of what calculates the Buffett indicator, right? Because I'm not an economist, I'm not too sure about it, but I saw it was looking at market share and then overall GDP. So it's clear to then, if you take those two things together, to understand, what is the real impact of AI. There's a lot of promise, there's a lot of potential within organizations, and we can save time and money. But that ratio is getting bigger and bigger. So on the back of that, do you think that we are in a bubble of some kind, where if we don't actually materialize these benefits, and we don't actually approach things like Slassog suggests, we don't focus on things which are meaty and actually impactful, do you think we might see a bubble burst because of that?
Again, I try not to sound like an oracle, but yeah, I think there is just a certain mechanism where hype essentially, and it's one of the guests on one of my podcasts actually pointed out, is that hype is a mechanism to get a whole bunch of actors to work together, right? So
Mhm.
if you want to do capex invest heavy stuff like buying a whole bunch of NVIDIA chips, right, to train LLMs, you need power for that, you need high end chips, you need a whole bunch of things. And so hype is a way to get all these resources to come together in a decentralized way, meaning it's not any government saying, okay, we're going to take this slice of our budget, of our sovereign budget and invest it, but it's really private actors coming together. And so hype in that sense, for whether it's railroads and electricity and all of that, in that sense, I think very much there has been a capex boom. And the latest estimates, I think, from all the big investment banks globally, their analysis of what's going on, I think the estimates are around a third of US GDP has been driven by capex into sort of quote unquote AI, basically LLMs, in the last couple of years. And so you're right about that, Yoshi. Whether I would call it a bubble, how fast it'll burst, I think is something that I'm still sort of developing conviction on, but it is a likely scenario. I wouldn't say it's guaranteed, but I think it's a very likely scenario.
Cool. And like what I mentioned there, if companies do follow more effective measures and implementation of data strategies and AI, we do move to a better place, and it mitigates that risk, right? And that kind of moves us on to Slassog. So can you tell us a bit more about the acronym Slassog and kind of what it means?
Yeah, sure. So the Slassog is a 6-step framework that I introduced in my book. And I just hold it up because I happen to have it on the table.
Yeah, give it a
But
plug.
it's save, leverage, align, simplify, optimize, and grow. And the idea is just, it's like it, just like any framework, it's not a recipe that you blindly follow, but it gives you a lens through which you can structure your thinking more clearly, and especially towards really driving impact, right? So that's sort of Slassog in short.
And in one bit, you kind of mentioned, and the bit that took me on is around simplifying processes. So the second S of Slassog. And that's something that I find quite interesting because, as you scale and grow companies, you need to have processes in order to be able to do things efficiently. I mean, you could argue, high alignment, high autonomy, and these sort of things, but processes are really important. Now, in your book Data Impact, you talk about simplifying these processes. So how do you go about simplifying processes within enterprise organizations who rely on some of these processes?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very legit question, and I think the reason why I argue for simplification, I think, is important, and the very first principles reason, which is the following: that if you ask yourself, how is complexity born, right? Because if you say I want to simplify, then you first have to try to understand what is the mechanism that increases complexity. And there's Joseph Tainter, who's done work on the collapse of civilizations, and civilizations in some way are the largest form of organization that you can imagine. And he looked at a whole bunch of them, like I think more than half a dozen around the world. And he looked at it from a perspective of energy economics and efficiency and a whole bunch of, and sort of complex systems, etc. And his finding, and his insight is the following, which is that complexity is born through day-to-day problem solving, meaning you're running a big enterprise, something breaks down somewhere, someone does their job, meaning they see it break down, they try to fix it, they eventually end up fixing it. And so if you think of it like a building, something gets chipped off, someone puts a bit of plaster, and then you repeat that, and you repeat that at scale. And that's the birth of complexity, right? No one wakes up in the morning and says, let me increase complexity. So complexity is born through this process of this self-correcting mechanism of sorts.
I don't know. I think there are a few people out there that quite like complexity.
If only you say that, because for me, the emergence of complexity is life, right? So I see life as being the number one factor for evolving complexity. I mean, you look at the moon, you look at all these things, they're effectively containers. They don't have life, they don't have complexity. And leading on to a line where you mentioned as part of Slassog, you talk about you have to have entire organizations focused on business goals. Now, to have an entire organization focused on the same business goals, you have to have so many lines of communication and a great level of alignment through people, right? So can you speak a bit more about how you can get people focused around or being aligned to the same business goals that they have? Because you can get so much fragmentation, which could really diminish the value of kind of what you're saying. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I think it's almost like simplify in terms of how do you achieve your objectives. And something to keep in mind there and is that we essentially have three value creation paradigms. That's sort of the case I make in the book, which is we have the industrial value creation paradigm. That's where that's factories, and that's component labor and capital intensive infrastructure, etc., and all of that producing industrial goods. And the characteristics there is that the costs of replication are essentially constant, right? Meaning this paperback is an industrial era product, right? This is Gutenberg's time, which means if I want to create another copy of this paperback, it'll cost me around the same. Personalization costs are also around the same, meaning if I send you, James, a copy of this book with an extra chapter personalized to your questions and your interests, and I do the same for Yoshi, it's going to be constant cost of replication for me. Right now we move to the digital paradigm. But what changes there is, that's Kindle, or that's whatever ebook reader you use. So my replication costs are essentially zero because it's the same file. I don't have to invest anything to sort of make it available to the n+1th person, but my personalization costs remain. And so as we move into the data-driven digital paradigm, the more I know about each of you, I could actually generate a chapter personalized to what you need or what you want. And so what is important here, and I'll just link the simplify to the align part, right, which you were speaking about, is that these are three completely different value creation paradigms, and the way you design processes and operate in each of these is hence also different, right? You cannot just take, let's say, the reductionist, sort of let's break down a process into small steps industrial approach, which is also where this use case based thinking comes from. And that might still work in the digital paradigm, but in the data driven digital paradigm, if you're thinking in use cases or in like reductionism, you're going to destroy the very logic that makes this paradigm magical, in the sense that replication and personalization costs are zero. So what I'm trying to get at is that there's a doctrine of operating in a certain paradigm which has to change as you move on. Because if you come, it's like early tanks, right? When the British introduced early tanks in the First World War, they would just go over trenches. So it's a very different way than you wouldn't let cavalry charge into trenches. Not going to work. So a tank in some ways replaces a horse with a soldier on it, right? But brings more firepower. It allows you to do other things. And then very quickly people realized you could shoot these from below or you could blow them up. And so then you have military doctrine around combined arms warfare, right? So tanks are effective only if you provide air support, if there is infantry protecting them, right? So what I'm trying to get at is if you look at you should stop looking at technology like your fridge and your washing machine. It's not something you just buy off the shelf, plug in and start using, and then you'll start winning in the market. You need to think of it like a weapon in the battle of the market you're in, right?
And it's also quite systematic. So, like the way you've mentioned it, with the tanks and you have air, it's all systematic.
Well, it's funny you use the analogy of the fridge, because that's exactly what we said. There's so many people, particularly in project delivery, who think, we actually had a meme of this in our newsletter of someone going out and buying AI as if they were buying a fridge from Curry's and say, yeah, job done. But as you say, you can have two people that both implement AI or buy some kind of AI solution. And one thinks about it strategically, and then, as you say, thinks about the firepower that's got to go with it and the cover. And then the other one who doesn't, one will be a lot more successful than the other.
Not just successful, one will get killed and the other one's going to win. I mean, I don't want to make it dramatic, but that's just how it is, right? You are in a market. I started my career as a trader, right? If I made money on a trade, these are zero sum situations, right?
Yeah.
And okay, it's true that that the market does grow over time. So I don't want to, it's not entirely zero sum, but it's not as if we're all we can all win and go home either. So there is a certain element of your win or your loss is someone else's win or loss. And that's how you need to approach this. You should not be naive. Like, you're not a consumer, right? This fridge approach is a consumerist way of looking at technology. And that's what it is. And no one consumed their way to wealth or consume their way to winning. So the moment you sort of internalize that, you stop looking at it as a consumer, you're already on the path to winning.
Yeah.
You're not guaranteed a win, but at least you're looking in the right direction.
No, really, really interesting stuff. Just before we move on to talk about AI and what's happening with AI, I want to ask you something around data maturity models and data maturity assessments. It was the big kind of buzzword, and every organization was doing these data maturity assessments. And what I've found is you do it, you identify the as is and the to be and the gap and all that stuff. But then it kind of sits in a drawer. Is that your experience as well? And if so, what can we do to stop people saying, well, I've dealt with my data issue because I've done a data maturity assessment, but then not actually deal with the outputs of that data maturity assessment?
So actually, I have a very sort of fundamental disagreement with this way of looking at data, right? So, and I think it all arises from a couple of platitudes that I think are destructive, are dangerous. I mean, one of them being data is the new oil, right? So now suddenly you say, okay, data is a commodity. And my argument to you is, if you're saying data is a commodity, then how can it at the same time, yet logically, how can it also be the driver of value creation for you? So you can either say data is a commodity. If it's a commodity, then it's, whether you have it or I have it, and it's not oil, right? So like, if it were oil, then you've already destroyed any potential it had to help you win uniquely in your market. Right. So you have to see it as proprietary. You have to see it from the lens of how does it create value. And the moment you agree to these two things, then by definition, it cannot also be a commodity. Right. So coming back to this data maturity, etc., these are all lenses. So the underlying assumption in all of these approaches is to treat data as a commodity, and completely counterposition to this, because my experience and my understanding of this is anyone who's won with data has treated it, has thought from first principles around how data is a driver of value creation for them, right? So because like, if you speak to investors, they'll use language like moats, they'll use language like competitive advantage, they'll use language like proprietary edge. And I started my career as a trader, and so you're always thinking from that lens, because if you do something that everyone else can do, then it does not even matter whether you do it. It does not matter how beautifully you execute on something if someone else can do the exact same thing. And when you combine that with the operating intensity and drive of a services person, right, or a hands-on operator, then it's very clear that you cannot look at data as data. You need to look at data as part of a larger doctrine, right, in a military doctrine, using the analogies we used, but also seeing data as part of a system that helps you win in a market.
Yeah, because it's quite a lazy analogy, isn't it? Data is oil. I think a better one is saying, well, you actually got to refine it, and that's where you layer on your kind of your own principles and your own company's lens to turn that data into. You've got to do something with it. The construction industry is actually a really good example because actually we have lots of data at the end of a construction project, but hardly any of it's used. Having the data doesn't solve the problem. Everyone's
Exactly.
got the data. The ones that will win will be the ones that refine that data and turn it into some kind of wisdom, whether that's wisdom that they can layer AI on top or whether that's wisdom that they can sell in some capacity. But yeah, I kind of broadly agree. I think it's a neat analogy, the data, new data is oil, but I think it's a little bit tired now. We've been saying it for a while.
I think it's because of the scale, though, right? The more you have, you can assume you can do more with it. Building more advanced models. The scaling hypothesis. Bigger network sizes, more data, more inference compute. You could assume that the more you have of something, the greater of something that you can build.
But
That's
that,
kind of what
again,
Ilya. Sorry, go on, Ritavan.
yeah, no, Yoshi, exactly. That is the industrial lens, right? And that's why I sort of try to make the case out at the outside is think in terms of paradigms, because that's industrial paradigm thinking.
Yeah.
The more raw material I have, right, the more machinery I have to work on it, the more people I have, right, as
Yeah.
component labor, the more my output. But the point is the nature of the data-driven digital paradigm is that your replication and your personalization costs are essentially zero, right? So your replication costs are zero, your personalization costs are tending towards zero, right, if you're learning over time. And so the supply side does not matter, right? In the industrial age, if I have 1 ton of steel, I can only make something with 1 ton of steel. I cannot do more. I can be efficient about it. I can, right? And the best case, I have zero wastage and I use the entire ton of steel, but I'm still constrained by the ton of steel.
Yeah.
So quantity matters, input matters. All of that is irrelevant in the data-driven paradigm because it's all about demand, right? The supply is the replication costs are essentially zero. So how, why should you even bother about supply, right? Or it's a secondary concern. It's not the primary concern. The primary concern is what value are you creating for whom, right? What demand are you capturing, right? Which customer are you delighting, right? And how? And then you figure out the rest. You start from there, because if you start from the supply side and I need more of it and I need to I need more equipment and I need more people and all of that. That's like taking the cavalry way of charging, into the battlefield when you're actually, when you actually have an armored brigade.
Yeah. It's quite smart you mentioned that, because I saw, because on the Western front, applying this sort of AI models, GPT-5 is supposed to be coming out soon. Llama released their Behemoth and their Maverick models. They were all huge in size, and now there's a request now for heavy data centers and infrastructure. And then we go back to the earlier in the year when we had the DeepSeek R1 or back end of last year, which then crashed a lot of NVIDIA stocks because of how efficient it was. And then now there was another model, another Chinese model recently, a hierarchical reasoning model, which was effectively still emulating the way the brain works, right? And this is tiny in comparison. It's like a few million parameters in comparison to the billion you're getting. Yet on RKGI, which is assessing complex reasoning and agentic like tasks, the thing was scoring better than I think it was like O3 and some of these more frontier tasks. So I guess the level of curation you have and the more systematic of things you add into what you have, and not just treating it as oil, like you mentioned, the one single paradigm of being the industrial age is important. And Ritavan, we've never had someone actually mention it in that way, so that's quite insightful.
Yeah, very insightful.
Yeah.
Can we move on to how we actually start applying some of these principles from your book to people in project delivery? Because, as I said, a lot of our listeners are grappling with real world projects. So can I ask firstly, how do your ideas apply to these delivery teams who are under huge pressure? And they might say, well, we don't have time for strategy. We've just, going back to your point about quick wins, they just running around with their hair on fire, like you say, trying to get to the next quarter and deliver the profits they need to deliver. What would your advice be to that person saying, look, I want to do this, but I just don't have time?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just understanding the game you're playing, like understanding the system you're in. So yes, by design, you're a delivery team, and so you need to deliver, right? That's clear. And it's true that if you don't deliver something in the short term, you won't be around in the long term, right? So accepting these constraints, right? Accepting these requirements. It's also important to understand that if you only deliver the quarter, and then after a couple dozen quarters looking back, you wouldn't have built the trust that someone else who thinks on a slightly longer, or who additionally thinks on a slightly longer time horizon, would have built. And so if you want to go, if you want to grow and sort of and over time sort of really capture, sort of build more trust and capture market share and grow, etc., then you want to be thinking beyond just only delivery. And so strategy is no longer some kind of PowerPoint deck that you show people, right? Strategy for me, and something, I also argue in the book, is strategy has been misused, according to me, for a whole bunch of abstract of sort of irrelevant and abstract BS, right? For me, strategy is really a layer of abstraction, right, that allows you to that helps you orient your decisions, like you're as an operator, right,
Mm.
in delivery. And so in that sense, right, strategy defined like that, I think, is super critical. And so just taking half an hour a day to take a step back and to try to build a rigorous sort of mathematically optimizable model that is at the same time empirically valid. So let's unpack that. So you want to develop an understanding of the game you're playing, right, of the work you're doing, in a way that allows you to model the trade-offs. So if you were to do this, and why is that important is because there are trade-offs, whether you admit that they exist or not, whether you think about them or not. If you even say something like, I just want to run ahead, well, running ahead is also picking a direction. So it's not as if you cannot, like, it's not like I'm asking you to sort of imagine stuff, right? It's just wherever you are, right, you're going to be surrounded by trade-offs. There are going to be a bunch of options, and they will have implications, short term, long term, etc. And so the idea strategy in this case is about taking a step back and building a layer of abstraction, right, that allows you to understand that, to model this, to understand this. And empirically valid here means that you don't want to just do it on paper, meaning you don't want to do pure math, right? You want to make sure that you can test assumptions you make.
But do you think the level of abstraction that companies deploy when building their strategy is too intense? It's too much. They do too much abstraction, because at times they'll have a lot written down. They'll have so many different pathways and processes, like you mentioned, which come out as a result of the strategy, that it doesn't actually become executable.
Actionable, yeah.
Yeah, so
Actionable.
my personal experience is that it's not as if they're doing too much. I think they're just not making sure it's empirically valid, right? So let me unpack that, right? So if you look at like, let's say you're doing construction work, so you have to buy a whole bunch of inventory, you have to keep it ready for various phases of your construction work, etc., right? So if for whatever reason now you try to forecast how much of what material, raw material, inventory, etc., tooling, whatever you'll need, and let's say you did a simple point forecast, right? So you said, okay, on this day I will need X units, on another day I will need Y units, etc. So so you try to do that for all your products, for all your materials, right? That's how most people usually do it. And it's super easy because the finance guy knows exactly what it means. It says, okay, we'll need 7 units of this on that day, multiplied by the price means I need that much budget available to buy it, right? So finance people love this. But if you look at it purely from an operational point of view, an execution point of view, this assumes basically that you have 100%, more or less 100% certainty on how many units you're going to need, which is not true. This is empirically just not valid. There is a fundamental irreducible uncertainty in the world you operate in. And so now, if you started looking at this as if you now model this probabilistically, so you say, look, 80% probability we're going to need 7, but then there's a 15% probability we need 1 more or 2 more, right? And a small 5% probability we need a little less, right? Now suddenly you have a richer, more empirically valid representation of the world. It's not reality, right? We can't get there, but at least it's more rigorous. And now you might ask me, okay, but haven't you just made it more complex? What's the point of this, right? Like, I mean, how do I show someone a probability distribution? The point is, this is not to show to your finance guy. You can still give him the number 7, he'll multiply it by the price and budget his stuff, right? Or she can do that. But the point where this becomes now useful for your entire portfolio of inventory and products that you'll need is that now that you have a distribution, it allows you to optimize decisions. Right? So that allows you to model trade-offs. If I need 9 units and I only kept 7, right? What's the cost of having 2 less? If that cost is that my construction project is delayed by a month, right, then it's a no-brainer that you buy 3 or 5 more and keep them on inventory, because so now suddenly you're looking at envelopes of decisions, and now your decision making abstraction, your framework for decision making has just gotten way more rigorous, and gives you the flexibility, the rigor, right, and the dynamism to just decide better and move faster and just win compared to anyone who's not doing that.
So
And
you
making
become more
data-driven
informed.
decisions. So it's like that sensitivity, and
Yeah.
particularly on project delivery, I don't think that's there. There's still so much done on gut feel and
Yeah.
supposed experience, but what you're advocating is, using the data you've got to, it still comes to an answer. Oh, right, the decision we're going to make is we need 7, but there's a logic behind that 7, and there's a thought process behind it. You thought about the second order consequences of only having 7 rather than 9. It's really interesting. Sorry, Yoshi, I think you were going to.
No, I think it's spot on. It's like giving a window. It's like giving a window. Is basically what informed decision making is, because you're not just plucking a number out of the sky. You aren't being completely prescriptive, but you're giving a window of where you can have room for an option effectively. So it's really cool.
Yeah, in fact, if I knew 80% that I would need 7, but that if I knew if I was just 1 or 2 short, then the project is my construction work is delayed by a month, I would probably double the 7 and keep 14 at all times, right? Because the cost of buying 7 units versus a month of delay, right? I mean, I'm not saying it'll always be the case, but I'm saying suppose it was a month of delay and buying each unit is not very expensive, then 7 is the most accurate forecast, right? Point forecast. Keeping more is still more, is in terms of optimizing the outcome, optimizing the decision, right? It's still better to keep double of that. And so I think what happens very often is people obsess about forecasting and say, oh, my data is clean or it's not clean, how accurate are my forecasts? But the point is, the forecast on its own is the forecast on its own is an artifact that is not useful, right? In the sense of, or is not, it's not an outcome, right? The forecast is a step towards something greater, and that is optimization of something, right? You need to be clear about what you want to optimize and why you want to optimize it, right? But that is what matters. And so this is something I've been saying forever, which is that if I had the most accurate weather forecast and I told you, when you step out after this podcast and you go for a walk, it's going to pour, and you step out without an umbrella, my forecast is irrelevant, right? And this happens in so many organizations. People spend money, are obsessed about forecasting just to show, look, we're putting so much effort and we've spent so much money and we have a million dashboards. But what's the point of all of this if you're not optimizing an outcome? Because you win in the market when you optimize an outcome. If I predict the S&P 500, right, is going to go up X% tomorrow, and then I don't trade, right, I don't go long or short or whatever, I won't make any money.
Yeah, so it's leverage. It's the leverage point, isn't it? It's leveraging those decisions, leveraging that wisdom that you've gained from refining the data to a point that
Correct. To optimize outcomes, not optimize ML models, right? That's my job. I know how to do that, and I can do that, and I can build you a great forecast. But if you do not decide based on that forecast and change something on the ground, then it was a waste of time.
Yeah, really fascinating. We're going to move on to the last section now, because we're getting towards the end of the podcast. So what I really like to do, Ritavan, is ask a few questions about you, if that's okay. So you're an author and you've got this fantastic book, which we'll give people the details of later. But what's a book that inspired you, a book or an idea? And it could be outside of tech or data, something that's changed the way that you see the world.
So I think something that shaped me a lot was a whole bunch of books around on our longer term investing and value creation. Richer, Wiser, Happier, The Education of a Value Investor, Thando Investor, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Right? So I think the entire sort of community of people around the world that is interested and tries to think longer term and create value and compound value longer term. I think that's something I find very fascinating. I'm not personally, I don't run a fund or something, or I don't invest, but I think that thinking is something that has really sort of shaped how I see things and how I try to operate. So the idea is, you think like an investor, and then, you try to operate and execute better.
I think you can see that in the way you approach the podcast. You can see how the influence of those books have influenced the way you've been on the podcast.
Well, the theme is this whole theme of execution. Like, I think it resonates so much with me, because we see so many people living in dashboard hell with so many supposed insights, but no one's actually actioning them. And
Yeah.
I think even from the books you're talking about ideas maybe from other disciplines, but the key thing is that you can execute on them.
Yeah, and you just need one insight. If you have one good insight, that's enough. You don't need a million. And I think that level of leverage, simplicity, and all of it comes together, right? At the end, let's say you're investing, right? You want to make money. You need one good insight, and you need to act on it. You do that, you already won. Right? And there you might have people with a million insights who don't do anything about it. What's the point?
So Ritavan, just moving on to kind of a question from me about you as well. What's something you've changed your mind on recently?
Yeah, Yoshi, I think that's a great question. I was thinking about it. I've been thinking about it for a while now, and it's the following, which is that over a decade of operating, I always obsessed about moving fast, about quick wins, about delivering quick value. But what I've realized is, and reflecting on a decade of operating, is if you sprint and win every 100-meter race you run, you're still not going to be the best marathon runner in the world, right? Or the best sort of medium long distance runner. And I think that is something that's really that I'm obsessed about and trying to unpack and figure out is how do you win the marathon? Because it's not like you have to pace yourself, right? So it's not like it does not mean that you're slack, right? It does not mean that you run slow, like that you chill or relax or something. It's just that it's a different logic, it's a different game you're playing, right? So you still have to run each 100-meter segment at a certain speed. So it's not as if you can walk now suddenly, right? Because humanly it won't be possible to catch up if you're too slow at any given point. So it's a different game with different rules, with a different logic and a different competitive strategy, right? But it's different from the short-term one, meaning you cannot use the 100-meter winning playbook to win the marathon. And this is something that I'm really sort of obsessed with. I think that's probably going to be the follow-on book.
And I think that goes back to something you said really early on that resonated with me about recovery and taking time out so you can actually think about things. Too many of us are in the trenches, and the marathon analogy works brilliantly there, because the key to running a marathon as well as the training is the recovery times.
100%.
Ritavan, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. So many insights, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Where can people find out, firstly, more about you? And secondly, where can they get hold of your book? We'll, of course, put the links in the show notes, but if you'd just like to let our listeners know.
So the book is available. The book is called Data Impact. It's available across all Amazon markets. For those who don't like Amazon, just Google it and look for your local online or physical bookstore. It should also be there. So that's where the book is. I'm relatively active on LinkedIn, so I'd love to connect with you, especially once you've read the book and sort of want to discuss it or unpack it. So the reason I wrote this book is not because I wanted to become an author. I wrote this book because I want to give you value, and one of the ways to do it at scale was to write a book.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, it's a real privilege actually to have read it and giving your insights to the world. We thank you for that, Ritavan. Thank you so much. And all that remains to be said is again, thank you for coming on the show, and we hope we can keep in touch. And I just encourage everyone to get hold of Ritavan's book, and we will see you all again next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, James and Yoshi.
Project Flux is here.
That's a wrap for today's episode. But before you go, exciting news. Project Flux is teaming up with Project Management Global to bring you the latest in AI-driven project delivery and essential management insights. Through this partnership, expect weekly AI insights, practical tools, and expert thought leadership, ensuring you stay ahead in the evolving project landscape. Stay tuned for exclusive content, joint research, and strategies to supercharge your project outcomes. You can learn more at www.pm-global.co.uk and be part of the future of project management. See you later.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want, so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.